Okay, welcome everybody to the Writing a Design Brief webinar. This is our second webinar in the ReFresh webinar series, and thank you very much for joining us, everybody. This is quite an informal process, so what will happen is you'll hear me talking through slides and topics as we go, but you can use the left-hand chat box to put your own points across. It would be great if we hear of your own experiences, things that have happened to you, any particular questions, any questions for anybody else in the webinar as well, and we'll try and address that. I'll stop roughly halfway through to try and address some of those, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So let's crack on with our webinar, and welcome everybody. So just a very quick background to the ReFresh project, because I'm aware that some of you aren't part of the ReFresh project but are museums within the South East. So the ReFresh project is funded by the Arts Council and run by the Museum Development Service. It involves 12 museums across the South East, in Surrey, East and West Sussex, and with one aim to refresh our displays and improve the visitor experience. And Kate Measures Consulting are coordinating Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this project. So that's just a little bit of background. That's me again on the top right there, if you want to see what I look like. Need to get a new photo. Okay, so who are we? Well, we work across the UK and the world, helping museums and galleries, historic houses, buildings, gardens, whole landscapes to improve their visitor experience, and in particular, their interpretation and developing family audiences. But how's that relevant to writing design briefs? Well, it means that we get a lot of everyday active experience of writing design briefs, and also what happens when a brief isn't so great. So our work involves working directly with designers and suppliers, helping clients to write briefs, helping clients to select designers and suppliers, and helping out when things go wrong. That's when we get the emergency phone calls, which happens quite a lot, and evaluating the end products and the relationship between designers and suppliers and the client, the museum, as well. So we are involved in the whole process, so that helps us to build up an idea of what works and what doesn't. But I'm aware that lots of you will have written briefs for your designers or suppliers as well, and have experience of this, or having experience of using other people's briefs, or even potentially have been given a brief yourself. So it will be great to hear your experiences as well as we go through the webinar, which will be around 1 hour long. So during today's webinar, I hope to have answered the question, why bother with a brief? And that's where we'll start. Have explored the important elements of a really good brief. And I'll give you a really simple structure, which is actually on the handouts as well, which is kind of key elements to include within a brief. How to help your designer or supplier understand your project quickly, and then time for questions at the end. One caveat to start today with is that we're going to go over the basic principles for writing a brief, and we're talking about a brief for designers or suppliers. So it might not just be a graphic designer or a web designer, it might be a different kind of supplier, like a consultant like myself, that you're writing a brief for. So it's quite a broad topic. This will cover everything from, a quick little £100, £150 job that you want doing from a local designer, to a massive exhibition project that might be several £100,000 worth. However, it's obvious that the amount of briefing and the length of your brief and the content of your brief needs to change depending on which kind of project that you're working on. However, all of the basic principles are still there. Okay, so last week, for those of you who attended our webinar last week on working with designers and suppliers, you'll recognise this step-by-step process from last week. And step 1 was the scoping process, so really understanding your project. And step 2 is the writing a brief for your designer or supplier. And last week we kind of skipped over that because we were going to cover it this week. So I'm going to refer to this, but don't worry if you weren't in our webinar last week. You will hopefully still understand everything. And if you'd like to go back and watch last week's webinar again after today's, you can do that as well. So we're going to be concentrating on step 2, writing a brief. And you may also remember from last week the REBA stages, which are stages of project development used specifically within the construction industry and by architects. And if you look closely on the steps on the left-hand side of the screen there, you will see that REBA Stage B is writing a design brief, the basic design brief. And this is also the same for the CIC work stage. This is only applicable if you're working on a really big project, really, but it's useful to know. Okay, so why bother? Let's start there. Why bother with a design brief at all? I'm kind of hoping that because you've joined this webinar, you're kind of converted already. However, I think it's worth repeating. So, 5 good reasons why to bother with a design brief. Well, reason 1, often we start off with a big splat like this of a project that's quite confusing and seems quite messy, and we're not quite sure exactly what we're wanting. And writing a design brief really helps us to convert that splat into something much more coherent. So actually the process of writing the design brief for a designer or supplier can help us to focus on what we really want and to help get agreement within your team, because it's written down, then your board, your trustees, your manager, your volunteers, whoever you're dealing with, needs to actually be agreeing that as well. And it means that you have a common understanding of what you're asking for. Reason number 2, okay, so that also means that this poor little chap with the question marks in the middle of my picture there is the designer or supplier, because often they get hit with a lot of tenders every year, or briefs every year, and they've got to try and understand your project very quickly. Now, whilst you're working in your organisation and your project every day, and you may have been working on a project for 6 months or so, a designer or supplier has to get up to speed with it in a matter of hours in all that thinking. So actually it can be quite confusing. And as someone who receives briefs every week, I've got to say that a good quality brief means that I can understand what someone's aiming for straight away and understand if we're the right people for the job or not within about 5 minutes. Whereas a poor quality brief will actually often either be disregarded, or it will result in a lot of questions to actually get an understanding of what the client is really asking for and what their project really involves, because a lot of them tend to be a little bit airy-fairy. Okay, number 3 is also that your brief form part of your legal contract, so with a designer or supplier, which is basically your comeback if anything goes wrong. Now, we always hope that things go wrong, but it's amazing how many times things do go wrong, or there are disagreements, or actually just simply people don't remember what has actually been asked for. And so actually putting together a brief means that if you reference that and append it to your official order, your purchase order, which is kind of the simplest form of contract, then that forms part of your legal contract with that organisation, which includes all that detail that you've put in there about what you're expecting from them and the kinds of things that you're aiming for. So that's a really useful document. Okay, reason 5 is it also creates a checklist against which you can go back at the end of a project and check that everything has actually been delivered that you were asking for. Now, this might seem a bit noddy, but in a busy, long project, for example, it's easy to forget some of the little nuances of the things that you ask people to actually deliver. And also, that also means that, for example, if there's staff changes or volunteer changes during the period of the project, it means that someone else has a reference document as to the legal contract that you have with this organisation and what you've actually asked them for. Or, God forbid, that you get run over by a bus or get struck down by a bowler. Those are both worst-case scenarios. We hope none of those are going to happen. So it provides you with a checklist, and it also provides your supplier with a checklist to go back and check that they fulfilled everything that you were asking for at the end of the project. And reason 5 is actually to help you get the right person for the job. So making sure that you're asking the right kind of designer or contractor to do your project is also really important. Finding the right skills and the right aptitude and the right experience. So it's almost like writing a job description. Okay, so moving on. Getting the right person for the job. So during the scoping phase, you need to match the tasks to the skills and time needed. And just ask yourself in-house, this is just a reminder from last week, is there anything that we are going to do in-house? What skills are really needed for this role or this particular project or contract? And how can we make this project cost and time effective? And those are all things to consider right at the beginning when you're writing your brief. Okay. Moving on. So, writing the brief. The brief is the basic foundation of the client-supplier relationship, which I've already alluded to, and it is actually, can become part of your legal contract. It creates a paper trail of those things that you've spoken about. So often we pick up the phone to a contractor or a supplier that we've worked with a lot and say, oh, do you know what, I just need this, I just need that, which is all great. And it's great to have those personal relationships. And that does form a verbal contract, but actually it's quite hard to prove. Especially in the kind of situations that we deal with, where we're dealing with quite small budgets often. So to give yourself the best backing, it's good to have something in writing as well. So even if you have those verbal conversations, just back them up by a quick design brief or brief for that supplier. The brief can be as short as 1 page of A4, so really quick, or it could be a really, really lengthy document depending on the size of the contract. Okay, so our design brief, let's get straight on with it. The basic areas that we're going to cover today are those 9 there, and this is our framework for our design brief. And if the simplest brief, you can literally just fill in really a few sentences under each of those, and that will become your design brief, and it may be just 1 page long. So, for example, if I am contracting an illustrator, and I'm just asking for a couple of illustrations, then my design brief may only be a page long, supported by some artistic reference materials to give them a visual idea of the kind of thing that I'm looking for. So we're going to work through each of these steps. So first of all, give them a quick overview of what we're looking for help with. So a really plain English description of what you need a designer or supplier to help you with. No more than a couple of sentences. And this is one thing that is kind of like your executive summary at the beginning. And this is one thing that a lot of briefs struggle with. And when you're receiving a brief, what you want to do is get an idea of the project really, really quickly, so you can decide whether this is right for you and your company, and to maximise the amount of quotes or tenders that you get back if you're in a quote or tender process. Really, this is kind of the sentence that you would say to your mate down the pub if you had to describe what you wanted from a designer or supplier. So that 1 or 2 page plain English description of what you're looking for. I've also described this as your lonely heart column entry, so it is kind of museum desperately seeking. I've just got a couple of funny examples because I couldn't help myself for a moment. These are really just inspiration to think about kind of how you can convey what you're looking for quickly. So it's your museum seeking. What are you really looking for? What do you really need? Okay, and once you've got that first, kind of your opening gambit, your executive summary, your 1 or 2 sentences on what you're really looking for, then a little bit of background to your organisation or project. Now, lots of design briefs go into almost 4 pages of this kind of stuff. You just need to put the important stuff in here. Very quickly, how you got to this point. How did you get to your project? Why the project is important? who it's for, and who is involved in the project. However, the designer or supplier doesn't need to know a huge amount of background, so anything else can go into the appendices or can be given to the successful company or person on commissioning, either at a scoping meeting or emailed afterwards. So just give them the things that they need to be able to understand how they respond to this brief or to give you a proper price. They don't need to know your inside leg measurement. The next step is to get them excited about your collection or story and the projects in particular. So you actually, I think, hopefully we all want our suppliers and contractors to be as excited about the project as we are. So this is your opportunity to get people excited. So your brief also shouldn't be as dull as ditch water, which they often are. So now, number 3 is a more detailed explanation of what you need help with. What do you actually want a designer or supplier to do? The key is letting the designer or supplier know what you want the design to actually achieve. So what would be your perfect end result for a design or for this contract? What would be, the absolutely fantastic outcome from this? And really try and pin that down. Okay, make a clear list of outputs here, so a bullet point list of what you're expecting the people to actually produce as a result. At this point, it's good to also include if you're expecting them to do things like site visits or meetings, because that includes additional costs. It's great to do that, and I know that I think Anushka mentioned in the last webinar that actually when you're going through the design changes process, for example, it's great to be able to sit down next to your designer. So to have someone local, either they come and visit on site or you go to them. And also, if there are certain types of design where somebody really needs to have visited the site, for example, if they're developing a map for you, people really can't develop an effective map without actually having visited the site. It's very hard to. Include maintenance, snagging, and any service level agreements here. If you're dealing with a very small contract, it's unlikely that these things will need to be included, but this could also include guarantees of work, for example. And that's particularly important for things like exhibitions, permanent exhibitions. And be clear about where the copyright will lie and what files you want at the end of the process. So I would always say that try and get all of the editable artwork files if you can, but let designers know that that's what you're expecting, because that means that if you want to change or edit something later and you have either a license to the copyright or you own the copyright, you can do that. If you don't have the editable artwork files, you can't do that. I will often also ask for illustrations in black and white as well as in colour and in high and low resolutions. So that gives you ultimate flexibility afterwards. It also maximises the input that you're able to, the value for money from what you're buying. I hope that makes sense. So, and remember that actually designers and suppliers aren't mind readers, and actually, if you know something or you know really this is what we want, just let them know that. Don't think, oh well, we kind of know we want this, but we don't want to preempt the process or let people know that. We want to see what they come back with. Well, yes, you do want your designers and suppliers to be as creative as possible and not to restrict them, but you also don't want them to to try and ask them to mind read what you're actually doing and then assess them on the ideas that you already had and you already decided that you wanted to go with, but you haven't told them that. So be as clear as possible. So here's an example of a list of outputs from a real contractor brief, and this is a brief for a learning consultant, and this is one that we actually received for a project for plant life. So they've clearly itemised the outputs that they're expecting, what they're expecting the contractor to actually have developed by the end of the project, and you can see they're very clear. What would have been slightly clearer is, for example, on 3.2, it says a set of activity sheets, actually saying how many is a set. So at least 3, for example, would have been a good qualification. That's one example of outputs from a real design brief. And tell your designer about important things that you've already decided internally. For example, like hierarchy of information. On this slide, you can see that it's an exhibition panel from Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, Castle Lesby, and it's an introductory panel. They have a clear hierarchy of information that they've decided on with 3 layers of interpretation: a title, a secondary layer of interpretation, which is in a larger font, and then the main body of their interpretation. So so just be clear on that from the start if you've already decided on those things, and then your designer or supplier can work within that. Also, if you'd like a certain feel to your interpretation, this is a panel from the Royal Engineers Museum about their V2 rocket, which you can see in the background there. And you can see that the designer has had a brief to really embrace the theme of the interpretation and carry that through their design work as well. Also, any concepts such as using particular materials or design that will suit the interpretive content. So this is a panel from RHS Wisley, and you can see it's been designed to look as if it's the end of a tree trunk. You can also see that they've included a QR code in there, so letting designers or suppliers know that kind of thing as well, and also things like their corporate logo. Also stuff like how long you expect the product to last for. If you're actually buying, for example, an interpretation panel, you're buying the design and the actual materials for the interpretation panel together. How long do you expect that to last for? And other things, let me just go back to that one. Apologies. Other things like access requirements. So do not expect your designer or supplier to know what the current access and best practice standards are within interpretation, within public engagement at all. And just make it clear to them what you're expecting them to do. So things like short line lengths when they're designing. If you let them know that up front, you can see here the content is broken up with short line lengths on the right-hand side in that interpretation, which will help people to read that panel easier. And things like minimum font size, contrast between backgrounds and foreground, etc. Okay. And then also think about how much will you involve your audience in the design process or the development process. So it might be if you're developing an interactive, it might be like the brief that we just saw, developing some family activities or trails. How much will you involve your audience? Do you want to include in the process any evaluation or testing? Have you got any visitor insight that you can give to your designer or supplier to let them know a bit more about your audience? And if you're going to have any testing or evaluation included, do you expect your contractor to do that? And it's absolutely right to be expecting them to do that. Or can you help to do some of that to reduce the cost? And also it's a good professional development tool to actually be involved in that process as well. So how much can you involve your audience? So for example, for just thinking about Alan from Henfield. We were chatting in Henfield Museum yesterday, and we were talking about redesigning the interpretation in the display cases at Henfield. So one thing that Alan could do is to mock up those interpretation, new object labels and headers, and try that out with some of his volunteers and visitors and gain some feedback from them, and then feed that into a design brief if he was going to an external designer or supplier. Okay, so I just want to stop for a couple of minutes just for some quick questions and comments and your feedback on your experiences as well. So if you use the chat box on the left-hand side to give me any thoughts, that would be wonderful. I'm going to take a little drink while I wait for you to put any questions in. Everybody's being very chatty at the minute. You got any comments? Okay, so no comments at this point, no problems at all. Let's move on then to stage 4 of our design brief, design or supplier brief, which is copyright. And we did speak about this in our last webinar about working with designers and suppliers, and talked about it as a key issue, and it's one of the biggest things that trips up designer and supplier relationships, a disagreement about where the copyright will lie. And I've put this image of a copyright symbol burning because it may not be a burning issue to you, but it will become a burning issue to you later on when you want to try and change designs, reprint something, update something, make a correction on something. And copyright is governed by the Copyright Designs and Patents Act of 1988 within English law. And it arises when an individual or organisation creates a work or applies a work, if it is regarded as original, and exhibits a degree of labour, skill or judgment. So that really is nearly every contract that we will be putting out to a designer or supplier. That probably pretty much excludes things where we're buying a product off the shelf that's ready developed, and in which case we would just expect the copyright to lie with the supplier or the developer or inventor then. But for anything else, for example, creative work that we're asking suppliers to develop for us, then this really is a burning issue. So it gives the creator of the work, and that includes graphic design work, for example, and web design work, the right to control the ways in which their material may be used. The copyright will automatically sit with the creator of the work, and this is the most important thing when writing a design brief, i.e. your designer or supplier will keep the copyright of the work unless you agree otherwise, and the best place to put that in writing is in your brief. You may have no legal right to use the work again or change or update it, even though you've paid for it to be produced in the first place. So you can see why this has such big potential impacts on the value for money of a bit of design work that we have, and the practicality to be able to update and refresh our displays, for example, or a simple thing like a welcome leaflet or a map. If we don't own the copyright and we don't have the files for it, then we legally can't use that without going back to our designer and supplier and pretty much probably paying for the privilege to do that. Okay, so one thing you may do, you may ask in your brief that you or state that you will be the legal owner of the copyright, intellectual copyright or artistic copyright of the work that you're asking to be created. But you may also be granted a license to use it, and the supplier actually keeps the copyright. So I've just put up on screen a real copyright agreement that I signed about 2 weeks ago with an illustrator, Emma Metcalf, who works a lot in museums, and she uses a standard copyright license that's used by many professional illustrators, where she keeps the copyright, but she provides the museum a limited license to then reuse that within the context that's been set out in the agreement. So again, you might not own the copyright, but if you have a license to it, then at least you have some rights to then use it. Okay, so point number 5, the resources available. So this is in your brief, letting the designer or supplier know what resources that you're going to put in and what you're expecting them to put in as well. So a simple list of everything you can provide the designer or supplier with. So things like organisational organisational brand guidelines and logos. Images, so you have images already or expecting them to source them. Artistic reference. I don't know if anybody's put artistic reference together before, but that's basically like, for example, I'm doing a project at Tudor Merchants House in the National Trust property in Wales, and I'm asking an illustrator to produce some illustrations of some of the characters from the property, but I need them to be historically accurate. So I'll send them through some ideas on some other images of from the Tudor period, contemporary from the Tudor period, to give them an idea of the kinds of clothing, for example, that someone might wear, or the situations we might actually picture them in, so that it will be historically accurate. That's just one idea for artistic reference that you might use. And then also if there's an additional ring-fence budget for other items that are not included in the brief but are connected with them delivering it. So this is an example of a brief, and this is a budget. And you can see at the bottom there, the bit that I've ringed, that in addition to the budget, there's also a ring fence, what we call a ring fence. So it's a designated budget for materials, and this actually, in this situation, is kept by the client, but the contractor can use it to buy materials and props. Okay, so moving on, number 6.6 out of our 9 is deadlines. Really, really key. So anybody who's worked with designers and suppliers will know that putting in your deadlines is really super key, and actually keeping to them is one of the biggest challenges. So create a project schedule, which is really just about when things are going to happen and when you need things to happen. Simple time plan that helps you work out when your project will be ready and what deadlines you need to set for whom. Do remember to try and put some lead times in, and I would never, ever, ever give a contractor the real final deadline by which I will be biting my nails if things don't arrive. I'd put myself a cushion of time into that. So if I need something by the end of March, I might say the middle of March for a project within my design brief. Okay. These include useful deadlines for you and both the designer or supplier. And again, putting these down in writing in your brief will mean that you've got those agreed as well. So you can create your project schedule in 4 easy steps. Now you can do this in a lot more sophisticated way, and you could do things like Gantt charts and stuff if it's a lot bigger project. But if it's a small project, then this is an easy way to do it. And I've put post-it notes on the right-hand side of this just to remind myself that an easy way to do this is to write each of the activities. So define your activities. That's kind of what needs to be done to get the job done. And write each of those on a post-it note, and then you can just move them around and order them. So put them into order, and you can also do this as part of a work meeting, for example, with colleagues or other volunteers or staff, and it can help with debate as to when things need to be done, etc. Are there any other activities that are dependent on each other? So does one thing have to happen before another? Estimate how long, so an example of that, let me just give you an example, would be I'm working on a temporary exhibition at the moment for West Berkshire Council, and I can't finish the family trail until it's been the draft has been tested, which has now happened after half term, but that's one thing that is the final draft of the family trail is dependent on the testing having happened, and that's made changes as a result. And I also can't finish the final draft until the illustrator, who is working separately, has sent through her final illustrations as well. So those things are dependent on each other. How long, then think about number 3, estimate how long each one of these activities will take. And remember that you can have concurrent activities, so things that are happening at the same time. And put them all together, check check and add contingencies in terms of amounts of extra time, just to give you a bit of leeway for all sorts of things like sick leave and not being able to get hold of someone on a particular day, etc. And add in some lead time as well, which is that extra little bit of slack that means that you have less sleepless nights. Of course, this isn't always possible. So, just a few to remember, give enough content development and proofing time if you can within your time scale, and that will depend on how slow or fast your organisation reacts and how many people you need to go through to get approval. And remember, we were talking about working with designers and suppliers last week. We were talking about designing by committee and actually deciding early on whether who actually needs to be in the process and who has final sign-off, etc. Giving more time will help you to notice problems, and there's nothing more frustrating than have gone to print and then you notice a few errors in your leaflet, for example. But don't languish over the brief if you have very tight deadlines. The more time you spend on your brief if you have a very tight deadline, the less time your contractor actually has to deliver. So often someone will ring and say, we want a project doing, and it's like, oh great, that's fine. And then they won't finalise the brief for a month and a half, which means 6 weeks has gone out of the working time that I could have been spending on a particular project. And the same goes for any contractor. So it's good to get your brief right, but if you have a very tight deadline, then just getting something on paper, so you have a written agreement, is great. And those very basics could just be that one page, but allow enough time for the contractor to actually do their job. And as I said, this helps you to notice problems and errors in your work if you have more lead time and more slack time within your program. And I feel a bit mean using this example because the language is in someone else's second language, but it does make me titter every time. Okay, so number 7, budget. And this is this may not be the most important thing for you, or it may be the most important thing for your organisation. But for a contractor or supplier or your designer, basically that's what they'll look at first. That's what they'll look at. They'll look at how much are they allocating to this project, and when do they actually want it by? Because those are the key things as to whether they could actually deliver anything at all, the most basic. And then they'll go back through and read the rest of the brief. That's just life and the way that it happens. So make it as helpful as possible. Just make sure you say whether you're including or excluding VAT within the total. Some suppliers will be VAT registered, and if they're VAT registered, they have to charge you VAT by law. They're collecting it on behalf of the government. If they're not VAT registered, then they don't charge VAT. Including or excluding expenses, or is there a separate pot for expenses? Just make it clear, because you don't want to get any nasty surprises on your final invoice. Is delivery included? One of those hidden costs that comes up later and just bumps up the total cost of your project. Do you have a finite budget? And if you do, I'll come back to this in a second actually. Would you like your designer or supplier to source materials or print, or will you do that? Do you literally just want them to design or develop something? Or do you actually want them to source materials? And the same would go, for example, if you were commissioning an evaluation. Are they going to pay for the refreshments for a focus group, for example, or are you going to do that? And then also any assumptions you've made. For example, things like meeting rooms will be free, or venues. It could be that the designer will only use photographs that you already have copyright for, and that they don't need to buy any extras. You may also have a ring-fenced budget, that thing that we spoke about earlier, for paying for the license or use of particular images from other organisations that relate to your collection or the story that you're telling. So, question, again, there's our mind reader, fixed fee or quote, or would you like the person to quote for us? So are you saying this is the budget that we have and it's fixed? Or are you asking someone to quote for you? Now, if you have a fixed amount of money to spend, then it's quite good to let the contractor know that. But in some instances, for example, some councils, you can't let people know what the budget is. So you may want to let people know that roughly what sort of bracket of price you're expecting it to come into. Or are you asking people to quote for you? Now, for some things, that's relatively straightforward, but for others, it isn't. So some things are how long is a piece of string. You can spend £500 or £5,000 on the same thing, but you'll get very different products. So it's just something really to think about beforehand. General rules of thumb, exhibitions, generally, if you're going to a major exhibition designer, you need to be looking at £1,000 per square metre, but £2,000 for interactive technology heavy areas. Installation, that's another thing that people often forget about, but for example, if you're just doing one panel externally, you will still need someone to install that for you, unless you're very handy and you can do it yourself. You've got volunteers to do it. That would be great. But you may well need some specialist installation. Design and amends at £35 an hour plus could cost you a lot more per hour. So some designers or suppliers will say that they will have up to 3 rounds of amendments to designs, and then after that you'll be charged a per hour cost. So you may want to schedule that in or state within your brief how many rounds of changes that you were expecting them to do. Do you expect them to do an annual maintenance for an exhibition or interpretation? And this can vary between 2 or 3%. It's quite a good amount to allocate, and you may be allocating that within the brief, or you may be allocating that just within your annual budget. Contingency should be around 5 to 10%, but it really depends on the risk and the unknowns in the project. If you are working with a very small project, then you may well not need any contingency, or just buying something off the shelf. You don't need a contingency. But if you're working on a large project, then you do really need to put some in. There's always things that you can't account for beforehand. Then project management fees, your supplier or contractor, if you're asking them to subcontract for something or buy something for you, they may charge you a project management fee. It's normally between 15 to 20%. Okay, and finally, how to apply. How do people actually let you know that they're interested? So it might be just that they send a price back by email. That's fine. It might be a verbal conversation or a verbal contract. You might ask them to do a quote, and that could come in a variety of forms, and then issue with them an official order with the brief appended. You might want a formal expression of interest. You might have to do a formal tender, or you may have something a little bit more stringent. So you need to decide how you want them to apply. Okay, so those are the areas that your design brief needs to, your design or supplier brief needs to cover at least. There may be additional areas if you're looking at something quite specialist, but there may well be that you may well need a little bit less if you're doing a lot smaller projects. Just a couple of things to remember before we go into onto questions. And I can see that we've got some questions coming in as well, which is absolutely fantastic. It's all about communication, and that's what a brief is about, really. Just clear communication with your designers or suppliers to get the best from them, and for them to enjoy the process and for you to enjoy the process. So it's kind of like doing your homework. It's a little bit boring, but it does help to do. It will help you a lot in the process later on. And then finally, keep calm. You're the boss. At the end of the day, be assertive in letting people know what you're expecting and what you want, because you're the budget holder, you're the commissioning person, and you're the boss. So make sure that you don't get pushed around by your suppliers. Okay, So that's a brief outline to writing a brief for a designer or a contractor. And let's have some questions. I can see that you can use the comment box on the left-hand side of your screen. Comments, questions, any experiences would be absolutely fabulous if you want to use that chat screen on the left-hand side. So, 2 questions here. One first from Rob. Rob, Rob asks, budgets, are those percentages based on £1,000 per square metre, or are they on top of the £1,000 per square metre? Oh, which percentages are you talking about? Here we go. Okay. So the £1,000 per metre squared, not square metre, metre squared is for whole exhibition cost. But then on top of that, you need to add the annual maintenance and contingency and potentially project management fees as well. The exhibition costs per metre squared are kind of the ballpark figures to be working to. But obviously, the ReFresh project, for example, we've been doing projects refreshing displays on a shoestring, and that isn't the figure we're working to at all. We're working to a lot less, and you can do a huge amounts with very, very tiny budgets. So those figures are really for large-scale budgets. For example, if you were going for a major lottery project. So I don't know if that answers your question, Rob, but we'll come back to you if not. Okay, one from Rick. We are moving as a MOD museum, and I'm putting a design brief together, never done this before, as it's funded by the MOD, and want to know what quality standard will be used, such as ISO 9001 is the standard with museum designers. Yes, ISO 9001 is a nationally recognised standard to which you'll work, and there may also be quality assurance standards with which other quality assurance standards with which will want people to work, and things like there may be employment standards, all sorts of stuff. It really depends on who you're actually contracting and what specifically you're asking them to do. So as well as the ISO standards, there may be lots of other standards that you want people to work to. For example, environmental and conservation standards for objects that you're wanting people to work to. A lot of the ISO standards, for example, they are useful because they give a basic standard, but they are used across industry and aren't completely specific to the type of work that we're asking people to do. So it's great to put them in, and that covers you nicely for a basic standard and the basic quality assurance standards, for example, that you're expecting companies to do. But you probably need something more specific for the kind of thing that you're looking at. So also things like, for example, if you're looking at the whole of a museum redesign, you might be looking at lighting standards, the kind of standards that you're looking for, energy efficiency standards. There could be a whole raft of ISO standards that and non-ISO standards that you're looking at. Okay, have we got any other questions? Okay, Anna. Okay, so Anna's commented on that the figures that I'm showing are a lot higher than her experience, and as I say, a lot of museums do things on a lot smaller budgets. This is the kind of budget that you'd be looking for if you're employing one of the big boy kind of designers and suppliers, and that's the kind of budgets that they would be looking at for the higher end. And really you're looking at the 2,000 per metre squared end, not the 1,000 per metre square end. However, you absolutely can do so much on a lot smaller budgets. But the things that I don't think should change is the percentage for annual maintenance, or making sure at least there is some percentage for annual maintenance in your annual operating budgets. and also the contingency. The project management fees you may well not have because you may be managing the project completely internally and doing all of the procurement internally as well. Or your project management fees you might not even see on the final bid because they might just be consumed within the general amount that your supplier is charging you. So you might not be aware that they're charging you a fee anyway. Okay. Any other questions or comments, everybody, on writing, design and supplier brief? Anybody got any experience of things going wrong or things going really well? I have one from Sophie from the Museum of Farnham. In your experience, is a mixture of outsourcing and in-house design for exhibitions a good model to use? Are there setbacks in doing this? Thank you, Sophie. I think as part of the ReFresh project, especially in this phase, we're hoping to arm people a little bit better to do some of their in-house design, which I think is really useful to have capacity in-house to do some of your design, because there's always small jobs that you want doing, things like a sign for here, a sign for there, a small temporary exhibition, for example. The major setback for that is that you end up getting a house style and you only stick to that house style, and sometimes that can mean that actually getting a fresh pair of eyes and some creativity from outside in can really help to revitalise things. However, it does mean that you get consistency throughout, and it does mean that you can do things potentially a lot quicker, and that you are able to have complete control over the whole design process. So I think it's absolutely fantastic to be able to do things in-house. I also think if you learn how to design in-house, even if you do outsource, it means that you understand what you're asking for because you've done it yourself before, and you understand the kind of length of time, for example, it might take to cut round a picture to isolate it onto a white background, which you might be asking someone to do that, and then you get an idea of whether they're charging you the right kind of amount for it, and how long it should be taking people. So I think a mixture of the two is the perfect for me. I think if you outsource completely, you do lose some flexibility, but a lot of organisations don't have the skills internally, so you need the right thing that fits for your organisation. Isn't that just the politician's answer? So thank you very much, Sophie. Moving on to Rob. Copyright. We commissioned an artist and asked her to waiver her moral rights. My understanding is that this means we can adapt her work, e.g. crop it, change it to black and white. Don't know if this has any legal standing, but it's nice to know we have her agreement to mess about with her artwork. Yeah. The main thing is to get agreement and to get it in writing if possible, and to waiver her rights, so maybe her intellectual property rights, or maybe her moral rights to something. But as long as you have an agreement, that's great, with your designer or supplier. And again, effectively, probably what she's seeing is that she has given you a license to use that, rather than completely giving you the copyright, or that you have complete ownership of the copyright. Obviously, this is a huge issue for museums, ownership of copyright, because things like selling of images within or images of your objects, or images within your archive, or documents in your images of documents within your archive externally can potentially be a massive money spinner. Now, copyright is a really specialist area, and I would suggest that if you are dealing with copyright on a regular basis, that you go in one of the specialist workshops for copyright. There's quite a few running throughout the country. We can't provide specialist legal advice, but they are a great way to learn a little bit more about copyright. Are there any other questions before we finish? Just give you a moment while I take a drink of water. Thanks for everybody who's contributed. I hope that's been a useful background to how to create hopefully a quite lightweight brief if required, or something much more weighty if you're creating a large project, a really large project like Ricky's, which sounds very, very exciting indeed. If you're creating something massive like Ricky's, actually you might want to double check that with solicitors or legal legal advice as well, to make sure that your legal wording is really up to scratch. If you're just, for example, commissioning someone to create you a pop-up banner, you probably don't need to do that, and you're probably okay with the legal terms it has on the back of your official order and your brief appended to that. Okay, so we don't have any other questions. So on finish up our webinar, don't forget that there's a handout with all of the main areas to the design brief that I've been running through today for you to download. You just need to scroll to the top of the chat box and click on the link to download that. And also that you can listen again to any parts of the webinar if you'd like to by going to previous meetings on anymeeting.com/greedysquirrel. Today's webinar, I hope that we have answered the question, why bother with a design brief, have explored the important elements of a really good brief, have started to think about how to help your designer or supplier understand your project quickly, and then we've had a bit of time for questions as well, and thank you to everybody. Don't forget that to book on for more webinars and to let your colleagues and peers know. There's now 5 more webinars scheduled, 2 case studies next week of exhibitions on a budget, both from the ReFresh project. Thank you for those of you who are actually leading those. How to get a session on how to emotionally engage with your visitors, run by Adrian Tizier from the National Trust, who has many, many years of experience and is working in the top of his field. A practical guide to visitor tracking, which is based on some real case studies. The Psychology of Design by neuroscientists, I'm really excited about that. And working with communities to create displays and events by Gail Bromley, MBE from Kew Gardens and now international consultant, who's done a huge amount of groundbreaking community work at Kew Gardens. So I look forward to all of those. I hope to see you on those. We'd love to hear what you thought. This is only our second webinar as part of the ReFresh program, so don't forget to fill in the short survey after the webinar. We will be eternally grateful, and as you can see, we have made some changes as a result of that. And also, if you'd like to send any comments to me at katemeasures@hotmail.co.uk, those would all be very welcome. And thank you to those of you who did that after our last webinar as well. Thank you very much for attending. I'm going to stop the recording now. I'm going to hang around for a couple of minutes if anybody wants to ask any questions, and then I will stop the meeting and you'll be directed towards the survey. So any more questions in the chat box on the left-hand side?